Building service contractors work hard to grow revenue, manage their crews, and keep customers happy. But long-term success depends just as much on understanding the numbers behind the business. In today's conversation, I'm joined by a business coach to break down the most important financial ratios that every BSC should be tracking. So we're going to focus on those key ratios that provide real insight that you need, and we'll talk about how to make that work for your company, how to make the changes that you might need to make right now. And to do that, I'm pleased to welcome a regular guest, Jeff Carmen. He's a business coach and a consultant with Elite BSC. And Jeff, I bet you know your way around a spreadsheet.
Well, I hope so, but I enjoy spreadsheets. I'm kind of a nerd like that, I guess.
I don't hear that very often from people because I do not like spreadsheets. I like the simple ones I can understand,
Sure.
but when it comes to all those numbers,
Yeah.
not me. I'm a media guy. I would rather work with words than numbers.
Sure.
But Jeff,
Sure.
thank you for this today because I know it's going to
Yeah.
be a good topic to get
Yeah. Yeah.
into.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on. This is a great topic.
Yeah. Well, let's start at the beginning. Let's just talk about this. A simple question. What are the financial ratios that are on your radar that we will look at today?
When I talk about financial ratios, what I try to find or try to work with owners of companies to talk about things that help them price jobs so that or ratios that they can look at to help them price jobs correctly, to manage the work correctly, and then give them some guidance on is this sustainable for our company. So the four we'll look at is the as labor to sales ratio, which talks about how effectively are you managing labor. We'll talk about gross margin, which is just simply, is there any money left over after we paid the cleaners and supplies direct expenses? The third one is contribution margin, and we'll talk about that much more here in just a few minutes. But contribution margin says, hey, collectively, as our portfolio of business, is it helping support the growth of our company? And then lastly, we'll talk about cash on hand, which really is that idea of like, hey, if something happens, can we still make payroll kind of thing.
So I do have a few questions for you, and feel free to talk about those four as we do this. But I would like to know this: when you work with, as a business coach, as a consultant with building service contractors, and they ask the question, why do financial ratios matter more than my bank balance, revenue? Can you talk about that to set this up more?
Yeah, that's right. It's a good question. So revenue is, and everybody talks about growing revenue, and growing revenue is really well, but revenue kind of talks about how busy you are and potentially doesn't talk about how healthy you are. And so I think that's really important. And bank balances are how you're doing right now, but it doesn't reflect what it is that is coming up. And so these ratios are a good way. And I think about it this way: you could be running down the road, you could be running 120 miles an hour down the interstate, and everything's fine in your car and everything's great. But if your oil pressure is going up or the car's overheating, you still are running at 120 miles an hour, but you're getting ready to have serious problems. So these ratios are kind of like a little dashboard that give us an insight into the health of the organization.
I like that illustration. That's a good one. That
Yeah,
makes sense.
yeah,
Perfect.
yeah.
So, of all the numbers a BSC could track, why do you believe that these four financial ratios are the most critical for long-term success?
Yeah, and so I'll pair the first two. So labor to sales ratio and gross margin. Those two are helpful ratios to say, hey, how are we? First of all, labor is such a big part of what we're doing, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But those two say, how are we in terms of the discipline in running our business and discipline in pricing jobs? Contribution margin then takes a look at your collective portfolio and says, of all the work we're doing, what work is worth keeping? What work should we improve or work or jobs? And what are some jobs maybe we need to get rid of? And then that cash on hand is just a breathing room. It's just all BSCs need to be aware of the cash that they have in their company to be ready for emergencies that might come up. You lose your largest customer. So these are the four, there's a bunch, but these are the four that I think if I were to advise, these are the four that I would go with.
You just mentioned like which jobs might we get rid of, which clients maybe aren't a good fit. So let's talk about the ratio that tells a contractor whether their jobs are actually making money.
Yeah.
And what's a healthy range they should aim for? Because I tell you what, if you could pinpoint that, that would make a big difference in your business.
That's right. That's right. And so this gets a little fuzzy. This is the concept that I've been digging into a lot. And the ratio is actually contribution margin. And what I find is is BSCs that are say in between the $500,000 and made 2.5 to $3 million kind of get stuck in this. And this is what happens. So there's gross margin is revenue less direct expenses. And so that's your gross margin. And so you can take all of your customers and go right down the list and say, hey, here's my customers and here's our gross margin. And it's a good way, again, to check if your pricing is on point and if you're managing your direct costs. But what it's not revealing is this. We have this whole other set of costs called fixed cost, and then there's some semi-variable costs. So for instance, if we're trying to scale our business, but next year we look and we say, hey, we need to add an operations manager, or we need to add an HR manager, or somebody to head up our sales. So that's incremental new expenses that needs to be taken care of in the coming year. Well, contribution ratio is a factor that helps you look at that. And so we ask for a target. So gross margin for most people is going to land in between 30 and 40%. On the contribution margin, that needs to be between 15 and 25%. And let me give you an example on the contribution margin and why it's so expensive. So you could have a $2,000 a month customer that's at 75% gross margin, and that's going to contribute about $1,400 to covering all of your fixed expenses. On the other hand, you could have a $20,000 a month customer at a 25% margin, but that's contributing $5,000 towards covering those costs. So as business owners, we need to look and say, hey, which customers are contributing more towards helping our business grow and helping our business survive? And this is something that I don't think is talked about a ton in our industry, this whole concept of contribution margin.
No, that's a good point. Those watching should maybe dig into that a bit more and reach out, maybe ask you some questions as well.
Sure, sure.
So you touched on cash flow.
Mhm.
Which ratio will help a contractor spot those cash problems early? And maybe are there some warning signs that like, hey, I need to pay attention to this?
Yeah, so we just use a very simple cash on hand ratio, and the way that we look at it, or the way we advise people to look at it, is to say, what is if you took your cash and cash equivalents and you just divide that by your total annual revenue. And so what we're looking to do is we want about 8%. We want that number to be about 8%, which would probably equate to covering between, say, 30 and 60 days of cash. So in the event that something catastrophic happened, you lost a large customer, lost two large customers, one of your customers owes you 60 days and goes out of business. You still got to cover all that payroll. And so that ratio is something to keep your eye on. And if that starts shrinking, that's a sign maybe you're not pricing jobs for well, or you're not managing your expenses, but you want to keep that cash in there so you're not dipping in your line of credit too often.
A client owes you 2 months, goes out of business. That can't be good.
Not that's not preferable, but it happens from time to time for sure.
The cost of doing business, that has to be worked into that figure. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Yes.
My last official question, then we'll get your closing comments. Let's talk about labor. You mentioned earlier that's like the biggest issue or cost. I mean, and that's true with any business, but talk about that. Which ratio that we're talking about today helps contractors understand whether their staffing, scheduling are efficient, if they're maximizing their labor, or just draining profits.
Yeah, yeah, that's the number that we look at. It's labor to sales ratio, and it takes all of your labor costs. So when I say all labor costs, it's going to be the wages that you pay cleaners, the wages that you would pay supervisors, anybody that's directly involved with serving the customer, and that's going to include overtime. It's going to include maybe you use subcontractors. So take all of those costs, including the payroll burden, which is payroll taxes and general liability insurance. Put all that in and divide that by your total revenue. And so that number for most BSCs is going to fall between 60 and 70% of total revenue, which is kind of amazing that there is that much 60 to 70 cents out of every dollar is going to pay our workers. And so it's something that we really need to keep our eye on all the time. That particular financial ratio has a sister that's called actual to labor hours ratio. And so what we're looking at all the time, and at France Building Service, when I worked at France, we literally looked and said every single day on every single job, are we hitting our budgeted hours? Are we over? So we kept our eye on that all the time. And then that labor to sales ratio is one that we really looked at a lot.
As you talk about that, Jeff, you're supporting families. I mean, if you could look at it that way too,
That's right.
as a business owner, you're making a big difference in that local economy. Hmm.
That's right. That's exactly right. And as a business, our business, the BSC industry is a low margin industry. And so, I talk about this, 60 to 70% of all the dollars that come in go to pay workers. And then there's about, like the coverage rate or the contribution ratio is another 20%. So what drops out of every dollar that comes in is about a nickel or a dime. And so that's a lot of work to show up every single day to keep these buildings clean, to make a nickel or a dime at the end. And so it's it's a business where watching these ratios and keeping your eye on the small things can add up to a lot of numbers for sure.
Yeah, I can. And maybe one day all this will turn around a little bit to where cleaning's valued more. Maybe there'll be more in the budgets, all that.
That
So,
would be great. That would be
yeah,
great.
another
Yeah.
conversation. All
Yeah.
right, let's wrap it up. Any final words of advice for those watching?
Yeah, I think don't overdo it with ratios. Pick four or five. Some of these that I've mentioned are very good. Start tracking them. Get a system to track those. And then I would say this, don't chase revenue, chase healthy business. And so these gross margin and contribution margin are pictures into, is my business really healthy to help me grow into the future?